It gives me great pleasure to present the Technology and Entrepreneurship panel today, entitled Creativity Under Constraint. And today the discussion will be moderated by Adam Green from This Is Africa and the Financial Times. He's a senior reporter there, and he's very well positioned to moderate the discussion today because of the way in which so many of the environmental factors surrounding entrepreneurship will come into play in this discussion. And as is the case with the big personalities that surround entrepreneurs, they can be a handful, and I hope today is no exception. So good luck, Adam, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. So, yeah, I think the goal of this panel is we've looked at a lot of the big macro issues of governance and infrastructure, legal environment, and so on. But a real driver of development is entrepreneurship and people on the ground who are able to find fixes to problems, to economic problems, social problems, and so on. So I think the goal for this panel is to bring their own experiences to bear, and everyone on this panel has experiences on the front line as innovators dealing with some of these issues of innovation in the African context. So that's what we're going to be discussing. Just to introduce briefly the panel, and then I'm going to put one question to all of them, and then we're going to come back with a few pointers from each of their experiences, and then we'll open up to you guys for questions. So just to introduce them briefly from the far side towards me, York Zucchi is the chief coffee drinker at HelloHealthcare. That's the boss. Vahid Monadjem is the CEO of Nomanini. Ken Banks is the founder of Kiwanja.net and Frontline SMS. Simon Bransfield-Garth is the CEO of Azuri Technologies, and Vinny Lingham is the CEO of Gyft. So thank you everyone for joining us today. So one of the organizing theme of this panel is innovation under constraint. So we're looking at how people deal with constraints, how they find creative ways around them. So the question that I want you to come to each of you just for a couple of minutes is, in your own experience in your various sectors, is there a particular instance that stands out where you looked at where you faced a constraint, a resource constraint, some operational constraint? How did you tackle it in the African context? What kinds of innovation, creativity were necessary for you to overcome those shortcomings and find creative ways around them? So York, perhaps we can start with you.
Thanks. So I think maybe just to start with, I think Africa forces you to be innovative by default. The fluctuations of skill sets and infrastructure reliability means you have to be innovative. Your hard testing of your services and products starts right from the beginning when you're developing them. Such that by the time they're developed, they can withhold much more beating from across the whole spectrum of consumers and users and customers. In our case, we develop technology which we're in primary healthcare, so we employ about 2,400 people, 451 people across 24 countries in Africa. Primary healthcare is not hospitals, not doctors. It's in nurses, in mobile clinics, in rural clinics, a frail care center. That's the kind of environment we operate in, i.e. with users or patients who are very computer illiterate, and a lot of nurses that don't even know how to use a mouse. So there you have to develop systems that almost catch them before they can make a mistake. So if I dispense a medicine to him, it checks his bracelet, it checks against a database of a medicine and warns me that this medicine was already dispensed to him, or that I shouldn't give him an additional packet of Viagra today. Sorry. So that's a little bit our background.
Okay, Vahid, your chance to respond.
Yeah. I've got two bracelets. I think constraints in some way are the entrepreneur's best friend. I think it makes you think smarter and figure out ways to get through barriers that mean that you have a defendable advantage. You know, if you're getting into a space that anyone can get into, then you're not really leading the way as an entrepreneur. It's not going to be a unique thing that you're doing. Nomanini is a company that replaces the scratch card for mobile services, so prepaid mobile, with a very small terminal that enables people to print airtime and sell it. And as will be demonstrated by my lovely assistant. And we work with informal entrepreneurs, and the market across Africa is huge. But Africa is diverse and fragmented. We've got 54 countries, 250 odd mobile operators across these countries. We've got that constraint of having to enter commercial agreements in each territory made us think differently. And really, when we looked at the constraint of having to deal across this multitude of geographies, we realized that what we didn't have as a product, we had as a platform, and it made us think differently about how we approach the market. And I think that we're a very young company, but the potential across the continent is huge if you engage in a way that's relevant locally. And I know that was a big discovery for us. Was the constraint really makes you smart about how you're going to approach things.
Great, thank you for that. Ken.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invite to be here, obviously. I think when we sort of touched on it there with the number of countries in Africa and the diversity of it, I think when we talk about Africa, we still sometimes fall into that trap of thinking of it as one place. So I just want to make the point that when I say Africa, I realize it's not a country, but I will just say Africa just so we can broadly keep it as that concept. The Africa I started working in 1993 is incredibly different to the one today. And in fact, the Africa I started working in with mobile technology in the end of 2002, so about 11 years ago, was technologically very, very different to the one today. I've spent most of my life in development, at least, working with small grassroots non-profits, mostly in Africa. I didn't necessarily choose the continent as the place I'd do my work, but it seemed to be the one that seemed to keep pulling me back. And I was more than happy to visit there and help where I could. But I spent most of my time working with small grassroots NGOs, because over the years I realized that the constraints that the smaller organizations, the church groups, the farmers' cooperatives, the women's groups, the small schools, the amount that they could produce with the minimal of resources was incredible. Yet I would come home and I would read of tens of millions and hundreds of millions being thrown at various projects by international aid agencies and achieving very little, it would seem. So I was always fascinated about how smaller organizations, smaller grassroots organizations, often who understand the problems they're fixing much, much better than somebody living 5, 10,000 miles away does, who has to fly in to try and figure it out. If we could do more to help the organizations that own and the people that own those problems, then I think we could actually get a lot more done, and we could amplify the outputs that they can actually come out with, despite the constraints they worked under. My main project I started on in 2005 was a text messaging platform called Frontline SMS, and that came out of spending time in the field, mostly South Africa, seeing mobile phones appearing around almost everywhere. In 2003, they were starting to appear, accelerated ever since. And back then, people were actually saying, why are you working on mobile phones in Africa? There aren't phones in Africa, are there? I mean, there was very little coverage. Phones were still largely contracts, and contracts you needed an address, you needed credit history. So there were some really big constraints even to owning a phone back then. But since then, incredible things have happened. And if you even question today the role that mobile phones are playing in international development or development across the continent, you're called stupid. Whereas you were called stupid 10 years ago for even thinking of using phones. A lot has changed. Frontline SMS was really just designed as a tool to enable grassroots non-profits who are working on local problems to actually use the mobile phones that were appearing around them to do two-way text messaging, to contact farmers with market prices, or to give them advice, or to let the farmers text in and ask questions, to send health information to people, to allow people to report government corruption, or to help in election monitoring. I've not actually been to any of the Frontline SMS installations. It's now in use in 145 countries, a large number of African countries, thousands of users. It's been quite a surprise to me that if you just build tools and give them away to people without any ties, without any constraints yourself, but just be very, very open with them and say, hey, look, you're doing great work, here's a tool. If you think it can help you, you can have it. If you're not interested, don't worry. Then really, really interesting things can happen. And that's really where I've come from in this whole sort of technology, innovation, constraint space.
Cheers, Ken. Simon, to you.
So many of you will know Herman Hauser, who was one of the founders of ARM. And he said that when they started ARM, they had two advantages. They had too little time and too little money. And so, in other words, they actually had to think about the problem rather than just doing it the conventional way. We were facing the problem of how to provide power to villages in Africa. And there is a problem in Africa that the cost of energy, if you're living in a village, is extremely high. If you're using candles for lighting, you're paying about 160 times as much for the energy equivalent as you would if you plugged a light into the wall over there. It's not 20% more, it's over 100 times more. And so solar power actually works phenomenally well in Africa, and the payback times are very short. And we couldn't understand why solar power, or why Africa wasn't completely awash with solar power. And it turns out that if you're earning $3 a day, it's really difficult to afford $50 to go and buy a little solar home system. So we ended up combining solar and mobile phone technology so that instead of having to buy your solar power system up front, people could pay for it as they used it, just they did their mobile phone, using scratch cards or top-up payments or whatever it may be. And those top-up payments are roughly half the cost of the kerosene and the mobile phone charging fees that they replace. So in effect, you get solar power and you get it net free. In fact, it's better than net free because you save yourself about $1 a week as a result. And that relatively small innovation has built into a business which is now operating in 9 countries across sub-Saharan Africa, and will have something in excess of 100,000 customers this year.
Thank you. And lastly, Vinny.
Great. So I'm going to give a slightly contrarian view. The notion that that the lack of, so the problems we're trying to solve in Africa, and just give you background, I started my first company in 2003 in South Africa called Clicks to Customers, paid search engine marketing back in the day where you said that to anyone, they'd look at you with a blank look on your face, and PPC. And we were doing that for Google, and today that company is, it's one of the leaders in the field. I left after that to move to Silicon Valley purely because lack of capital, constraint growing the business. So we couldn't be more creative about the business because we had with Reserve Bank regulations and everything else in South Africa, it took us 90 days to receive money from our clients overseas, and have the money clear in our bank. So for me, capital constraint, the creativity part of it was actually just deciding to leave the country because of the constraints in building businesses, and I subsequently raised venture capital in my subsequent ventures. So the question, or the insight that I've got is we need to solve that capital problem in Africa. We need to start getting capital into the country through venture, into the continent through venture capital funds and foreign investments in a more aggressive way, because otherwise we'll have people trying to solve problems which aren't really problems in other part of the world, and the creativity is being applied to the wrong things. And so, not taking away from obviously the stuff that great entrepreneurs are doing right now, solving problems, but if they had capital, they could do a lot more. And that's for me, that's a huge stumbling block right now.
So let's, in terms of the rest of you guys, I mean, to what extent have you had to raise capital for your various projects, and how have you gone about doing that?
Sure. So Nomanini is a very young company. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've raised about $1 million from friends, family, and fools. Another $750,000 from some very early stage VCs. But I think quite honestly, the constraint for us hasn't been capital. I think we could hire more people, but we'd be pressing on the gas before we understood the problem. I think capital is difficult to get, but it hasn't been what slowed us down. What slowed us down really is really understanding and distilling what we do and focusing on that pinhead and knowing what that pinhead was. And that's changed over the last while. And I think the more capital we had, we actually would have just picked up more momentum before we really understood what we were doing.
York and Simon, have you had to raise capital for your projects, and how has that experience gone? York, maybe we start with you. York, we can maybe start with you and then Simon.
Just as a way of background, I'm Swiss, worked all over the world. Until 7 years ago, I decided to move to Africa to take advantage of the world's attention turning towards the continent. And I thought as an ex-banker, I'd be more successful at it. I was fired 5 times from different banks. I thought maybe I could just hide that part of a CV. So we completely and utterly failed to raise a single cent in funding. So if you want to know how to write a business proposal, let me know. So we had to invent a business model which required no funding other than my savings to pay sort of the overheads of the basic office. So we developed HelloHealthcare, which was really a cooperative model along the lines of if we're all operating the same segment and the primary healthcare space is very fragmented, when I go pitch for business, well, why can't I sell also your products and services? Why am I only selling mine? And so that was the birth of HelloHealthcare. And from then on, we actually just used the money from the clients. So we were in a very lucky position that we never had to raise capital. And also, we're not infrastructure players. So ours is a service-based industry, which doesn't require huge capital outlays.
So from our point of view, I mean, I think it's a universal truth that if you have more money, you can do more with it. And it's also a universal truth that you can get money much more easily in Sand Hill Road in California than pretty much anywhere else in the world. I don't know any entrepreneur in Europe who doesn't complain that the venture capital environment doesn't exist in Europe either. So I'm not sure it's a specific problem to Africa, though I think I agree it's very difficult in Africa. We've actually not found raising equity difficult. That's been relatively straightforward for us. The thing that we require is debt finance, because effectively we're putting equipment into the market and we're getting paid back later. And the challenge is when you go and speak to private equity houses and to banks and so on, they look at Africa and a sort of glazed look comes over their eyes. And it sort of doesn't compute. And so there's a tendency to say, well, come back to us when you've got 4 years of trading history. And that's fine in 4 years' time, but it doesn't actually help us right now. So you have to find creative and innovative ways of getting around that. But I'm not sure that that's any different to how the world's been, except in the late 1990s when there was a dot-com boom. I think it's always been tough like that.
I mean, debt finance is that's the problem I face. I mean, I had a profitable business from day one. I had a 90-day cash flow shortage, and I had to sell equity to finance a cash flow shortfall. And it was guaranteed. I mean, literally, I literally got the check from Wells Fargo, Bank of America. I would deposit it at Nedbank in South Africa, and they tell me it's going to take 6 weeks to clear. I mean, it was quite remarkable, and from listed U.S. companies, and that was just there was torture. Because you sit there having to pay bills and salaries, and you don't have the capital, and I think that from my perspective, it's easy for us to be sitting up here as guys who've at least made it and built some capital and some wealth for ourselves. And even when we started, we might not have had, well, but we might have started off, like I didn't have a lot of capital to start off with, but I had something when I was young. I sold a townhouse and I made like 50,000 rand, so it was enough to start my first business. But you look at the youth of today in South Africa, they don't have 2 pennies to rub together, and for them to start getting capital to start something, they get stuck in this sort of low income trap. Okay, you get these guys who are intelligent, they're creative, they've got education, they're busy paying off student loans and the like, and I had some experiences, but they can't get that seed money. They can't get that capital to start their first business, to quit their job and go into something. So it's very difficult for us to get out of this poverty trap in Africa when the youth who have got the ideas, they've got the creativity, they've got the and they've got the education as well. There's just no capital available for them to start anything. And no one wants to back them, and they can't get money from banks. There's no VC, literally. There's no VC in Africa. In South Africa, I think there's 4 VCs, and I think one of them's got a guy who's actually started a company before. The rest are all bankers, so they don't give money to entrepreneurs. It's kind of a weird situation. So I think that's what I'd like to see more of that happening, more backing these guys straight out of university. They don't have any overheads, they don't have any kids, they just finished their degree. Don't go take a job at Standard Bank or Nedbank or whatever. Go and start a company. If you fail, that's fine.
I think there is a problem that goes beyond just capital. So if you speak to Acumen and you look at the rate of return they managed to get from doing microloans, in general it's been pretty abysmal. The loans get paid back, but the companies don't tend to grow into larger organizations. And so it's not just a case of having capital, but if you're setting up a micro business in India, then you probably don't have FedEx that comes anywhere near your house, and you don't have running water, and you don't have reliable electricity, and you don't have reliable roads, and your transport costs are much higher, and so on. In other words, there's a huge infrastructural problem that has to be solved. And it seems to me that the way to solve that is to get partnerships between Western organizations that don't have those difficulties and local on-the-ground companies that understand their customers and are able to grow in that space. And certainly the way we've worked, we've got 15 people in the UK. There's probably, Wanda will tell me, but I don't know, 200, 250 in Africa who are in our distribution channel. They're selling scratch cards, they're installing things, they're doing all sorts of other stuff. And we do the bit that we do well, which is pick and place manufacture, or designing products that could be pick and place manufactured in Malaysia, using capital that comes from the City of London and so on. And those guys are doing what they do fantastically well, which is working with their communities, selling products, teaching people, developing and so on. And there is one myth that I think is worth highlighting in Africa, and that is there's this myth that last mile distribution is difficult in Africa. And the evidence for that is that the only thing you can reliably get across Africa is mobile phones and Coca-Cola, pretty much. Actually, that's not true at all. If you go to a village and you offer a clear proposition to somebody in that village, you'll get 100 people who come to you who want to come and do the last mile distribution. The problem is not the last mile. The problem is the processes, the systems, and the infrastructure to get you from a container in Mombasa to something that is intelligible to somebody in a village who can then go and distribute and make it happen and so on. So it's about bringing expertise, knowledge, learning, capital, and so on, of which we got plenty in the West, and combining it with the skill sets that you got in Africa, so you get something that works. You don't want something that's imperialist, where you basically have a Western company that comes in, rapes the country, nicks the money, and goes away. And by the same token, if you simply try and build it organically within the country, then it's going to be tremendously difficult compared to how it would be if you were going to build it externally.
Let's talk a bit about innovation now, because innovators are products of their environment, and they're enabled by their environment. And if a Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg were born in Kinshasa, they probably wouldn't have amounted to what they would if they're born in the US or if they go to Harvard and so on. So when you guys look at the different markets and the different environments in Africa, do you see any that, we're talking a lot about constraints, but do you see any that can provide that minimum, we've talked about capital, but that minimum of the overall ecosystem that you need as an innovator? Your proximity to other innovators, which is one very important thing, infrastructure and so on are another. We're hearing a lot about Kenya as quite a dynamic hub of technology, even sort of Silicon City, people getting perhaps a bit overexcited. But when you guys look at different markets, do you see any particular areas within Africa where some of those elements, some of those ingredients are starting to come together? Let's go from York and come up. Ken, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy just to start off, yeah. Well, the iHub in Nairobi was started by a very good friend of mine, Eric Hirschman, who, the thing I like about Eric is he sees problems because he's based in Kenya, and he actually goes out and does something about it. So talking about investment, for example, him and some friends last year, I believe, set up Savannah Fund, which I think might be Kenya's first VC fund. At least, well, one of the very, very early ones. It could be that.
Paul Berghill from Silicon Valley is the guy who moved down to make it happen.
Right. Yeah, so there's 3 or 4 of them that got together to actually create this. And Eric created the iHub because he saw a lack of a space for entrepreneurs, for innovators, for business people to go and, as you say, to meet other people who are working in similar areas, to get that cross-pollination. So he created the space, then he's managed to figure out where to get the funding, now looking to build a maker space to allow people to actually start to manufacture and hack stuff, because there's a lack of that in Kenya too. I think the reason Kenya perhaps is a great example of something that's happening in a very, very exciting place. I think the expat community is very, very active. So you look at Ushahidi, the team of which was largely responsible for creating the iHub. When the Kenyan election crisis kicked off in 07-08, most of them weren't in Kenya. Most of them were in the US, where they actually got the whole thing going, but many have returned home. to actually try to figure out how to empower local innovators. So I think that's one. And also connectivity, of course. I mean, Kenya is quite fortunate to have a fibre landing off the coast. Whether you can argue that's actually benefited many people or not, I mean, whether the prices have really come down for broadband access that much or not is more debatable. But that's certainly helped. And of course, there's things like M-Pesa, which a lot of companies now are building businesses off the back. They've actually got a mobile phone payment system with APIs that you can just go and start playing around with. So we don't have that in the UK. The US doesn't have that. So I think there's some quite nice stuff going on. And now, if you look across Africa at innovation hubs in general, I did a bit of research for the Nike Foundation 2 months ago, and I found 95 innovation hubs across Africa, and I probably missed some. So these spaces, whether or not, again, they actually create anything, well, everyone's waiting for the African Facebook or the African Google. They're waiting for this kind of big breakthrough. And Ushahidis are held up as being one of the biggest technical success stories from Africa at the moment, but it's a non-profit. It's doing great work, but it's not a business as such, although they are moving into certain areas, like they're creating a new Wi-Fi thing called the Brick, which they've just raised money on Kickstarter for. So there's lots and lots of things happening there. But I think the fact that there's now these little incubation centers, little hubs of activities, university students who maybe previously wouldn't have studied computer science or business because there was just no jobs in it. It was like studying to program a PC in Zambia in 1985. There's just no point in studying to program a PC. No one had PCs. Suddenly, I think university students are seeing the opportunity to get technical skills, to learn how to run businesses, because there are now opportunities to do that. And as more money comes in, and the Savannah Fund is hopefully the first of many funds across many other countries to provide fairly small scale. I doubt the Savannah Fund is going to be doing hundreds of millions. I think its total fund is about 30 million or 20 million or something. It's quite small at the moment. But if that can succeed, I think then that would draw in and attract more people to that equity issue and to that financing issue. And that combined with the innovation hubs and the students and just this whole area of excitement and local empowerment, that maybe for the first time, many Africans are able to sort of start fixing their own problems. Because when I started in development, if you wanted to do development, you have to go and build a dam. That was development.
And piggybacking on that, maybe we're opening, for example, Africa's first healthcare innovation hub in October, so 4 months from now. And one of the drivers was actually the problems you highlighted, which is there's a lot of people who can't find funding. And I'm going, well, shit, we don't need the funding per se. We need a sort of infrastructure support which relies on mentoring, the support, some introductions to business to open the doors so that their service or product solutions can be taken seriously. So we took the lead, for example. We take students, just graduated, and give them, find out what they're passionate about, what interests them, and give them a project within our company to take over. And if that is successful, we actually create a completely new PTY Limited, in which we generally say take 40% off a company and give 60%. So we try to create companies that way, because then they have that ecosystem that helps them and supports them. Because the reality is most students, including myself, when I graduated, shit, if you had given me a check, you would have lost all your money. I didn't know what the hell I'm doing. And it just comes with experience, with screwing up here and there. Sorry about the swear words. So I agree with the ecosystem needs a lot of leadership from business to be created, and a bit of risk taking.
There's also this issue of scale, though, because we often hear Africa's the land of the promising pilot project, thousands and thousands and thousands of great pilot projects. But then when we try to look at what is it that managed to really set the fire going, we kind of struggle. I mean, M-Pesa is often the example that we come back to again and again and again. And it's so nauseating now that you always come back to M-Pesa and you're like, where's the next M-Pesa? Or at what stage are we going to see more technologies that move from a pilot stage to a countrywide, region-wide stage? What is it that's blocking that process with some of these innovations? Simon?
Contentious?
Yes, please do.
I think those pilot projects failed because they were never viable in the first place. They were put in by people who had the best intentions, and but it never actually worked. So let's take an example. There's a project, it's actually a very good project. It's run by the largest pump manufacturer in the world called Grundfos, and they do a water pumping project, which is a pay-as-you-go water pumping type system. It's in India and in various other places. The problem is it's not viable. So the equipment that you need to put in to put the water pumping in means that the pay-as-you-go bit pays for the maintenance of it, but you've still got to go and find a donor to go and build the actual capital equipment in the first place. There isn't enough money in the business model to ever pay back the capital. And so whatever happens, it's always going to be a pilot because it can never get any further than that. I think what we're beginning to see now is people recognizing that, particularly when you talk about sustainability, that sustainable technology needs a sustainable business model, otherwise it's doomed, and it's just charity. And charity is great in as far as it goes, but you can't donate your way to prosperity. You've got to have things which are inherently economically viable, and we're beginning to see some of those emerge now in the market.
I would add to that, but I disagree with you. We have a Facebooks in this world. There's quite a few companies from Africa which are global leaders. Just forgotten that beer company in South Africa, SAB. It's the world's second biggest producer of beer. You've got MTN chairman this morning, a company which is spread all over Africa and in Afghanistan with technology which, I mean, those places should be dominated by the likes of Vodafone and the similarities. So there are quite, I mean, by last count, I think Gibbs in South Africa did a study of 55 companies that are global leaders. You could argue PayPal, one of the founders, Elon Musk with Tesla and all that. So there are African people who are out there making noises. It's just not advertised as much or as well known. That's just my view on that.
I think there's probably also a lot of businesses that don't fit the kind of sexy profile of a tech startup. But 2 weeks ago, I met a guy who says, I'm in informal retail in Lagos. Like, really interesting. What do you do? I own 1,500 informal retail outlets across Lagos. And that's a huge business, but that's never going to get covered in any media outlet. And I think there's a stack of those from within the mining value chain to informal retail that just gets overlooked. It's there, but it's not on our radars.
I think also, I think donors are to blame as well. I see so many wheels reinvented over and over and over, and they're all funded by different people for different reasons, and it just becomes a mess. It just becomes a complete mess. And people are still funding data collection tools for mobile phones when we already have about 30. And I'm sure one of those will do the job for most people. And many are open source, so you can just take them and build off of them. So I think donors have a lot to answer for. And also the fact that a lot of the projects, as you're saying, aren't viable, but they're not viable from a technological perspective either. If you went to a donor tomorrow with an amazing project called iPads for Africa, you'd probably get masses of money because it sounds amazing, but it's never going to work because probably iPad penetration across Africa as a continent is probably 0.0001% maybe, right? So the stuff that sounds sexy and sounds really, really kind of pushing the boundaries and innovative, and sometimes we think of innovative as being the stuff which is kind of way out there and seems to be completely crazy, but it may just work, is the stuff that generally speaking fails. The best way still of reaching people across Africa in communication terms is the radio. It's not even a mobile phone yet, so how many people are working on radio projects? It's old, it's not sexy anymore, not interested, but it's still the best communication medium.
The problem, of course, though, is that to come back to M-Pesa, M-Pesa was enabled by DFID, by the UK Department for Development. And so you do often find that somewhere along the line, you could see donors as almost like, companies have to try lots and lots of different things. They might fail 99% of the times. But you could say, well, even if DFID never does anything for the private sector ever again, the fact that it did M-Pesa means that all of those failures were worthwhile.
But you could argue.
Yeah, I mean, that's like saying that the space program enabled you to get non-stick frying pans. Yeah, you can get non-stick frying pans a whole lot less expensively than throwing money in random places and hoping that some of it sticks.
But most innovations, well, not most, but you look at a lot of major innovations that have been accidental, but you can't then say that everything that led up to that is therefore not relevant, because if it wasn't for all of that stuff, you wouldn't have had non-stick frying pans.
If you throw money in enough directions, eventually it's going to land up somewhere that is profitable, but it may not be the most effective way of doing it.
And does the panel think that people that haven't commented on this, I'm especially interested to hear from, do you think that donors have any role in supporting this incubation process? I know that a number of donors have set up private sector departments, these quite curious entities that are run by lifelong civil servants, advising the private sector on what the private sector should do, but have never worked in the private sector. Do you think that there's a role for that kind of function for donors, or should they stick to the traditional, conventional kinds of programs of healthcare, distributing vaccines, and so on? Vinny, do you have a take on this?
I mean, you bite my tongue.
Okay. No, don't bite your tongue.
No. Just I have this. I invest in a lot of companies in South Africa, and we have this problem all the time, where the donor model. I agree that the donor model doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work because there's no commercial interest really. When I said most of these guys they're out there just spraying and praying, and they are hoping for it. But things like venture capital, where you can invest in 50 companies in a sector and hope you get 5 or 10 winners out of the 50, that works. So, I think we should have more of a commercial focus. Then, to the whole civil servant thing, too often these funds are being run by people who have never built companies and never built products. And so, instead of embracing risk, they avoid it, and that's not the point of venture capital and investment in the region. But that's.
So one thing that, just to pick up on that point in a different angle, is this issue of social business and social entrepreneurship that we keep hearing about, especially in Africa. There's this big Skull Forum, and there's all of this talk of social entrepreneurship. And I saw a joke on Twitter a while ago that a social entrepreneur is a businessman that can't make money. Was that you? And I wonder about this issue that sometimes you speak to people and you're not clear whether they're running a business or they're running a social program, or where their priorities are, or if there's any trade-off between the two. I sometimes feel as though the two things are put together, and maybe we need to think a little bit more about, at the end of the day, when you get up, are you running a business? Are you running a public goods program? Where are your ultimate priorities? Are you trying to make something financially sustainable over time, which presumably means that you do have an overall responsibility to your bottom line? I wonder what are your thoughts on that?
I think you have socially motivated people, but ultimately it's very hard to drive a company or organization using metrics that aren't specific. And so if there is money with an objective to educate girl children in a certain country, and you're held accountable to those objectives, and that's great. But I think too often this social enterprise is used as just a way to target soft money. It's a bit of a coverall for all manner of sin. I think there are socially motivated people that run businesses, and those become social enterprises. But it's hard to tell the difference.
Okay, I've just seen the time, so I'm conscious that we haven't yet had questions, so I think it's be time to move to the audience now, and any questions that you guys may have for the panel. So we'll start with the gentleman here, if there's a microphone, or you could just speak loudly if not.
When we talk about innovation in Africa, most of you are mentioning innovation in the sector of IT or healthcare, but we seem to ignore the very technology which enables IT and healthcare, which is physical sciences, semiconductor, biotechnology. What's your opinion about the future and prospects of development in that area? And what should be done on the behalf of government and private sector? Thank you.
Interesting. Who wants to take that? Vinny wants to.
Too scared to answer that.
I can give a sort of Silicon Valley flavor. Africa doesn't have an edge in those sectors. The ship has sailed in many respects in things like semiconductors. I mean, you've got Silicon Valley, one of the hubs of the world. You've got the Taiwanese, the Koreans, even ARM in the UK. For Africa to catch up, the number of engineers that it needs, it doesn't produce. It's just the reality of it. I mean, South Africa produces something like 200 computer science, master's guys a year across the entire country. And if you look at, the types of people you need, it's the top 20 percentile. It's just not enough. You can't scale up big manufacturing or big engineering facilities with that sort of inflow into the market. So, and that's just, I don't know what the numbers are for the rest of Africa, but it's not big enough to make a meaningful impact. Biotechnology as well. I mean, you've got guys like Genentech in the San Francisco Bay Area and a whole ecosystem around that. Sure, there are pockets of excellence that could emerge, but for Africa to sort of rise to the fore of those industries, it's the ship has sailed. That said, there are areas where Africa could take a leadership position and actually and sort of build hubs and build areas of excellence. I think the one area where I'm struggling with right now, quite frankly, is the attention on what is right now known as the feature phone, where if you take a 5 or 10 year view and the cost of Android phones coming down more and more, how prevalent will those feature phones be in the African context? And should we still be building applications for those phones, or should we be looking broader and seeing how we could utilize what is even a quasi smartphone scenario for Africa? So. Yeah.
Necessarily of an answer. What can be done on behalf of governments and private sector?
Well, I think it needs a cluster focus. I think Africa needs to, governments need to band together and figure out what sort of high-tech clusters could we develop. I think it needs to be high-tech. I think there's a lot of disruption that's coming around the corner in many industries, from manufacturing with 3D printers to financial system services with virtual currencies and that sort of thing. So I think you've got to look further ahead than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years. You need to look 5, 10 years ahead and see where can we create an edge on the continent that can lead the rest of the world.
I can give you in South Africa afterwards 4 different partnerships that are currently ongoing with a lot of research and development and IP that is then passed on to the private sector. So there's a lot happening, much more than is known in the press.
Sorry. John?
Yes, so my question follows on that. We've heard a lot from you guys in many respects on many dimensions around your ventures, but the word policy hasn't really come into play that much. And what I'm curious about is not at a high level what governments should be doing, because the business cases around innovation are plain to see, and no one argues against them. But in reality, politicians aren't doing what they should be doing. And particularly in your experience, Vinny, in Silicon Cape, in Cape Town, what is it that is creating this barrier to action that will actually enable these ecosystems? I mean, is it a personal dynamic? Is it people getting paid off? Is it people not seeing a long-term view? What is it that young innovators can almost inculcate into their own ventures so that they can be advocates for policy as well as being entrepreneurs, and also lobby those efforts so they're concentrated enough to make an impact?
I think that from my experience, big business really does dominate. The big corporations do have a lot more sway and a lot more power in government than the startups and the small enterprises and the young upstarts can ever hope to achieve. So unfortunately, policy goes the way of what big business wants it to be, to a large extent. And that's not always good for the disruptors in society. And those are normally the guys with the new ideas coming up. I mean, I've seen many young, mid-20-year-old guys who have built businesses who they can't get them off the ground because regulations are too tight and internet costs are high. It's not coming down. It's a struggle for them. And I'm coming from a very sort of, I'm an internet entrepreneur, so I come from the internet side of things. I don't have a lot of experience outside that realm. But from the internet side, it's very difficult to build strong internet businesses in South Africa, particularly because of the cost of bandwidth, the speeds of internet as well. And it's improved, obviously, over time. But for the past 10 years, it's been lagging. And Kenya is doing a fantastic job and leapfrogging South Africa in many respects.
So what would it take you to return to South Africa and run a business there? I mean, it's a follow-up to what you just said. You've named a few things, but is there a general policy kind of climate that would necessitate that move?
So, I think let's just dissect the issues regarding, again, South Africa is different, but expats cannot own and invest in South Africa. And you're like, what do you mean? So my company cannot buy a stake in a South African company, give them capital to develop and innovate. Why? Because there's something called the loop structure, where South African citizens cannot own shares in a foreign. My company is a U.S. company. As a U.S. holding company, I can't buy shares in a South African subsidiary. That's illegal. Okay, so there's one example, and you know what? I mentioned that to a senior government official member, and who should know this, and he was like, "What?" They don't understand that, and so we've got to work around these things. When I want to make investments in South Africa, I've got to use. We spent $500,000 on one of my companies setting up a legal structure to legally bypass the really simple laws and go through and get Reserve Bank approval, everything else for a structure. $500,000 was just paid to lawyers instead of being spent on R&D. It's a stumbling block. It's a huge stumbling block.
think things are moving slowly, but I think if you look at some countries, there's signs that governments are starting to get it. I mean, Kenya, I think Kenya government opened their data sets up before, I think before the UK government, or pretty much at that sort of time. So that was a really big victory for the sort of Kenyan IT entrepreneurial sector. Rwanda, great example. I mean, Kagame, like him or loathe him, he's had been very, very relentless in pursuing a digital vision for Rwanda. In Botswana, the government opened a massive, huge innovation hub, which takes up I can't even remember the numbers, but it's absolutely huge. Now, whether it fails or not, again, at least it shows an intent and an understanding, at least a sense that they're kind of watching at what's going on and trying to figure out what they could do. On the reverse side, actually, if you look at things like M-Pesa in Kenya, companies that have tried to replicate M-Pesa in other African countries have been blocked by African governments because they've actually seen what's happened in Kenya, and then they run scared. Nearly 50% of Kenya's GDP goes through M-Pesa, a privately owned payment system. That's not a healthy position to be in. Surely the Central Bank of Kenya should at least have some play in that, but they don't, right? So I think in Nigeria they passed specific laws, and now in some countries you're seeing mobile phone operators buying banks, because the only way they can use mobile money is to actually be a bank. So it's kind of got crazy. So although, we talk about breakthrough innovations and all the amazing things that mobile money is doing, there are governments, while on one hand they might be trying to appear or at least try to understand this stuff and what's going on the other hand, they're actually almost deliberately blocking any advance. So it's a tricky balancing act for them.
And in Africa, just if I may add, anything you want, there's enough facts to justify that story, whatever view you have. You'll find some evidence, some examples of somebody to justify your view. So for example, Vinny had one experience of investing in Africa. We invest from Switzerland in quite a number of countries. We've got 6 offices across Africa. For us, it was an absolute joyride. It was less regular.
Because you're not South African.
Well, part of my shareholders are South African.
Oh, well, then don't say that too loud.
So we've had absolutely pleasure. It was very efficient, much more efficient than we had in opening our office in Italy or in Switzerland, funny enough. On your question, I sit on 2 committees of a government to help entrepreneurs in the tech world and so forth. So we fund a lot of initiatives. And it's not perfect by far, but there's a hell of a lot of good people in government rising quietly, but are not known yet, that are actually changing the systems for the better. It's far from a perfect world, I'll give you that.
Thanks, and I think that's probably a good moment to end on as we're up to time. So thank you to the audience for coming, and thank you to the panel for a great discussion.